and we're back with another episode of Gladio for Euro. I'm Russian Sam, and we will be joined momentarily by our co-hosts Liam and Halal Sam. And today we're going to be talking about the 2019 show Hernán, which was released by Amazon Prime, which tells the story of the Spanish invasion of Mesoamerica, what is today Mexico, from a very sort of old-hat Spanish perspective of the events that went on. It's not a terrible show per se. They do some interesting things. For example, a very large percentage of the dialogue is in Nahuatl and in a Mayan language, which hasn't really been done before, as far as I'm aware. These are the indigenous languages of the people that the Spaniards would have encountered. The show also heavily relies on the Spanish version of events, on the accounts of the conquistadors, many of which were heavily exaggerated or straight up falsified, as demonstrated by archaeological findings, as well as the rediscovery of Nahuatl language chronicles and sources in the last couple of decades. So we decided that talking about the show would be a great way to introduce our listeners to a more holistic understanding of the Spanish invasion of Mexico, the ways that it was accomplished, as well as some other factors. And to do this, we decided to invite a very special guest who is currently working on a project called Aztec Empire, which tells the history of the Spanish invasion of Mesoamerica and the overthrow of the so-called Aztecs, with a far greater degree of reliance on indigenous sources. His name is Paul Guinan, and he's a longtime comic book artist whose current project is titled Aztec Empire. With Aztec Empire, Paul seeks to retell the story of this invasion in a way that integrates the more recent academic findings to make them more accessible for a general audience and to tell what is just in general a very fascinating and engaging story. So without further ado, let's give it up for Paul Guinan.
Yes, the title is Aztec Empire. I wanted to get cute with it, maybe do some other kind of title, but I realized that, these days with so much material out there, it's best to just keep it as simple as possible so that the title has this kind of self-explanatory quality to it. What's it about? It's about the Aztec Empire.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for being here this afternoon. And really, I just wanted to commend you. It's a really, really fun work, really interesting, super readable. As somebody who is not particularly fluent in Mesoamerican history, it was a really helpful resource. And I'm really excited to see where it goes.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate how accessible it is.
Thank you. And you can find out what happens by going to the end of your history book.
Yeah.
It's a sad ending. Spoilers.
Yeah. So what exactly drew you to this history? Like, why did you decide that you wanted to make a comic book about specifically this topic?
Well, I felt this topic really wasn't being served well. There's just so many weird myths about it that were created by Spanish colonialists. Mm-hmm. I would read conflicting things about how this Aztec civilization was very sophisticated, but no, they were total savages. And so I've always been interested in world history, and I've always had an interest in science fiction. And this story is unique. It's an alien first contact story. So two sides of the planet separated for 10,000 years finally meet. It's a violent meeting. And it's just spectacular. It's colorful. It's a very strange story. There's so many little moments where everything could have gone wrong. It seems like it's just filled with all these coincidences and weird red herrings and all kinds of narrative devices that if you tried to do it as a fiction, people would go, oh, come on now. That's the fourth coincidence. I don't buy it anymore. So
just the fact that when Cortez landed, he almost immediately found a Spaniard who spoke Maya.
Yes.
He immediately had an interpreter, which is insane.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Also, the role of interpreters in this story is incredibly
really interesting.
And Melanesian being the obvious example, but we'll get to that later.
Oh yes.
So basically, it was just my wanting to do an epic history, and this was just such a strange, unique, and literally colorful story. Yeah. So I realized that I would have to do a lot of outreach before I even began. Because I'm a gringo. So I did for about a year. I just developed relationships in the Mexican academic community, activists, artists, and got to a point to where I started putting up pages online, and we get real-time feedback. And we'd get people saying, "Oh, you should change this," or "This is wrong." Yeah. And so far I have 6 episodes out of a planned 50. So I've got a few years a few years to go.
And I believe it's 500 episodes for 500 years of Mesoamerican history, right?
50 episodes.
I'm sorry. Yes, of course.
So it'll be about 500 pages when it's all done. And that's just the story pages. For every 10 pages, there's also almost half a dozen story notes.
I appreciate the story notes very much. They clarify a lot of things that I had been wondering and was embarrassed to ask, frankly.
No, I love all of the little cultural details, not only about the Aztec characters, but also on the Spanish side that you brought in.
Yeah, this is dealing with the two sides of the story, but most up until recently in the last few years, the story has been mostly like 70-30 Spanish. Most of the histories we read focus on the Spanish side of the story, and that's pretty much because we have more information. These conquistadors wrote stuff down, and then they also destroyed the libraries of Tenochtitlan, so we don't have a lot of information on the Aztec side, but we do have plenty on the Spanish side. So that's why a lot of people who adapt this story tend to emphasize the Spanish side. And I actually try and pay attention to the actual page count. I want there to be actually more Mesoamerican and Aztec material than the Spanish stuff. So.
Although it should be noted that right now there's a lot of work going on to make sure that the Aztec manuscripts that are available and which continue to be written even after the Spanish colonization by authors, Camilla Townsend, for example, is doing a lot of important work in that field. And finally, we're getting to actually hear the voices of these Aztecs who traditionally in the Spanish-inflicted historiography were depicted as being these bloodthirsty savages who they made big cities, but they also just killed people willy-nilly. And we're finally starting to see that they also, of course, had their own rich inner lives.
No, of course. And that's why it's so helpful, Paul, that you reached out to so many indigenous activists and people from these existing communities. Because we don't like to get too involved in current events on this podcast, but any history involving colonization is political. And I think that, like Howard Zinn said, you can't stay still in a moving train. So I think it's really important and helpful, and I really appreciate the way you incorporated that perspective in your comic.
Thanks. It's been very very interesting and very rewarding. We actually, my wife and I took a trip. Anina Bennett is my editor on this series, and we took a trip to Mexico City for the anniversary of the meeting of Cortez and Montezuma, and stood on the exact spot. And went to all the archaeological sites in the city that we could. Took 1 million photographs, and the project has been just really well received in Mexico, and I'm very very honored by that.
I hear that there's recently been a controversy about these events, about the commemoration of the conquest of Tenochtitlan. Like I saw that you posted some articles on Twitter related to this topic.
Yes. Mexico City is doing a series of celebrations this year. They are celebrating the fall of Tenochtitlan and the fall of the Spanish colonial period. But they, for some reason or another, wanted to include the founding of Tenochtitlan. But the founding is in 1325, so it's not 1321. So there was a lot of outcry, especially from the academic and archaeological communities, about politicians manipulating dates for these kinds of celebrations. And it's interesting that they would even do that, because Mexico City wasn't really going to do any kind of big celebration thing. When we were there for the meeting of Montezuma and Cortez, which I would think would be a little bit more of a positive kind of thing to celebrate than the fall of the city. The only official thing that they did was in the Zocalo, in the main square of the city, they had an opera. They put on an opera which was written by Vivaldi in the 1700s called Montezuma. And it was a beautiful production. It was they had brought in some Nahuatl speakers, so they sang in the indigenous language and had indigenous instruments, and so it was an adaptation of the Vivaldi opera, but it still contained the mythical plot structure that the Spaniards want to perpetuate with the story about how Cortez practically single-handedly and with amazing skill and knowledge managed to defeat this empire. And that was all that they did. The only other thing I saw while we were there was that the descendants of Montezuma and the descendants of Cortez met and shook hands that morning.
Yes, I saw that photo.
Yeah,
right. So, but that's about it. So it's interesting because the story is, the sort of good guy, bad guy thing doesn't really apply in this story. Both sides are complicated, and the result of all of this, the conquest and colonialization of Mexico, is fraught with all kinds of problems. It's difficult to talk about, and they decided, let's kind of sort of acknowledge it without really getting into it.
And the fact that they're celebrating simultaneously this year the fall of Tenochtitlan and also the fall of the Spanish Empire seems kind of contradictory.
Well, basically what it is it's essentially what they're celebrating this year is a bookend of Spanish colonialism. It's like the beginning and end of Spanish colonialism. Yeah,
it's kind of funny.
So that's, it's a strange thing to honor, or to celebrate.
Right.
So you mentioned that you plan to have 50 chapters for your comic. Do you have a specific endpoint in mind?
It will end with the fall of the city, with the capture of Cuauhtémoc. Okay. But I'll probably have an episode, another 10, maybe 20 pages of epilogue. That is to say, what happened to these characters, the central characters of the story, how they wound up, how Malintzin Marina, what happened to her, what happened to Cortez, things like that. But the thing is that's one of the problems about doing an epic history, is that really history is so intertwined with each other. It's it's like this DNA strand. You can't really untangle. You can't just chop it here and start here and end here, because there's things that lead up to it. There's things that happened afterwards. So it's like if you were to do a story about World War II, you would probably have to start with Pearl Harbor, or maybe going into Poland, and then end with the atomic bomb. But that's not the entire story of World War II. So you have to make these sort of arbitrary and in this case, like many history books, kind of military-based thing. That's the start of the war, the end of the war.
Right. Yeah. The treaties and dates, that kind of. Well, I think in any case, it's clear that you put a ton of care and research into this project, and it really pays off. And I think that all of that care and research is especially impressive in light of another Aztec project that we're going to talk about this evening. Well, this series is Hernán.
That tips it off right there about what kind of show it's going to be.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, the name of your project versus theirs, Aztec Empire versus Hernán, yeah. I'm just going to say right off the bat, I certainly didn't hate the show. I think there were a lot of really interesting aspects of it.
Especially visually.
Oh, yeah, especially visually. But when we're looking at depictions of history, as we're going to get into this afternoon, it's definitely, I would say, not a historically accurate or even historically responsible production. This show, released in 2019, Hernán, is a joint co-production by the Spanish company Onza Television, by the joint Spanish-Mexican production Dopamine, and also by the Mexican production company Azteca TV. But even though it's made by a company called Azteca TV, it's really just from the Spaniards' perspective. The depiction of indigenous characters, as we'll get into, is pretty stereotypical, and beyond any individual depictions, it's really going back to that European history book narrative that you mentioned, Paul.
Yeah, it's I feel bad for the producers on this, because they're having to deal with something that is outside of their budget. Even if they had twice the budget, they still probably wouldn't be able to depict it in its full glory. You absolutely touched on it. This is that the indigenous depictions are rough. They're most of them aren't dressed very nicely. They're the places where they live are very primitive looking, colorless. It was really surprising to see. There's, of course, issues with some of the depiction of the Spaniards, but that kind of thing is like really minor. Like they had the wrong sword hilt. Some kind of detail like that European militarists can really pick apart. But the depiction of like Tenochtitlan, it was just, what a dreary looking place. It was colorless and these slapdash adobe walls with They look like mud huts. It was profoundly disappointing.
And actually, this had the biggest budget of any Spanish language production to date, but clearly it all went into the costumes, which even then weren't so accurate, and didn't go into the sets or the CGI at all.
Right. Yeah. There was a couple of nice CGI master shots of the city from bird's eye view that look great. But then once we sort of get down into it a little bit, like for instance, there's sequences where the army marches in and out of the main plaza of Tenochtitlan with the big main temples. And it was just colorless. It was really surprising because if anybody, and especially for a production where you could go to Mexico's natural history museums or anthropology museums and see the stuccos and friezes and murals, and it's just an explosion of color. And they could have had some fun with the art direction where the Spaniards are kind of colorless and just wear brown leather and gray steel. But then they encounter this almost psychedelic kind of civilization. Right, yeah. I think that could have been a really fun visual approach to the show. And
that's another thing I appreciated about the art in your comic is how the priests and the jaguar warriors are very interesting in the way in the costumes as they're rendered.
Yeah.
And there's so much detail about the protocols of the court and etc. Like I really appreciated in the note all the details on how these things actually worked.
It was right away at the beginning when I was thinking about the look of this thing. I wanted it to have almost like a cell animation Saturday morning cartoon, primary colors. And again, I worked in comics for so long. The idea of being able to do a historically accurate depiction of some of these Aztec military commanders, and that they look like they're wearing superhero outfits.
They look cool as hell.
Primary colors. I just thought that was the coolest thing. And how come this TV show didn't do that?
Whereas in Hernán, they just look kind of. It's just not good.
No. They definitely put a lot of care into the costumes and a lot of money too. But I think for the most part, they just go back to the stereotypes. You have the Maya in loincloths and feathers, and then you have the Aztec characters in loincloths and drab coats.
Yeah, and the feather thing is a weird trope because certainly some military commanders would have little staffs that they would attach to their back that had little feathered plumes. They didn't wear feathers on their heads. Mm-hmm. And then some priests wouldn't even wear feathers. It was this thing called a deity impersonator, somebody who's dressed up like the god, sort of cosplaying gods. They would have all this regalia, which over the centuries has morphed into what is now called danza azteca. These essentially these dancers that you'll see in different cities, but you'll always see them in the center of Mexico City.
Yeah,
and they are. It's an exaggeration of Aztec culture. It's not accurate, but at least it gives you sort of a sense of color and spectacle.
Yeah. Well, I think actually this might be a good time to ask a very stupid question, but I think a pretty important question, which is, would you mind, Paul, explaining the difference between these three terms that come up a lot, that overlap a lot, but I know there's an important distinction. And the three terms are Nahua, Mexica, and Aztec.
Okay, so I'll take it out a little bit further. So there's Semanahuac, which is the entire world. The Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, deserts in the north, jungles in the south. So that's the whole world. Then when you go down a little further to the Lake Texcoco, which was this lake where Tenochtitlan was on an island, that's Anahuac. And so in Anahuac in particular, all the groups in that whole region, no matter what the city-state is, spoke Nahuatl. You always drop the L, so Nahuatl. And among the Nahuatl-speaking peoples, there were these groups. Now, for what we call the Aztecs, the way I use that term is to describe a political alliance of three groups.
Right.
So Texcoco, Mexica, Tlacopan.
Yeah.
So those three groups created the Triple Alliance. The Mexica kind of were the head of the Triple Alliance, so technically you can say the Mexica Triple Alliance.
Mm-hmm. And so is Mexica totally synonymous with the people of Tenochtitlan?
Yes. Well, there was the Tenochtitlan. Actually, it was a double city like Minneapolis, St. Paul. So there was Tenochtitlan, and then there's Tlatelolco, and those two groups, the Tenochca and the Tlatelolcans, formed this island city, and then they in turn allied with the two cities on the edges of the lake. To say, you shouldn't say Aztec, you should say Mexica. Well, then that all of a sudden, then you're dropping out people from Texcoco, from Tlacopan. What happened to them? They were part of the Aztec Empire. But basically, at this point, most academics, even activists, anybody who's really, really into this understands the reality of, the sort of generalization of saying just Aztec. It's kind of like up here in the United States where we just sort of say Americans, we're Americans, even though There's Central America and South America. So it's a shorthand like that people, that people at least understand who you're talking.
I'd actually like to zoom out a little bit farther. So Nahua is part of the so-called Uto-Aztecan language family, which before colonization really covered a huge range of territory from the north in around Utah, Colorado, and all the way down into basically right before the Yucatan Peninsula begins. And this was one big language family. And this really speaks to the fact that these Nahua peoples, they came up from the north. And this is something that they realized. They started coming down from a place that they call Aztlan, which is where the name Aztec comes from, which translates to the land of the seven caves. And so basically, the Mexican Valley had for a very long time been the site of these major civilizations and these cities. And even though they didn't really control necessarily the land all the way up in the north, they had contact with them. They would trade fairly regularly.
Yes, there were extensive trade networks.
Yeah, I know that I believe a lot of exotic bird skeletons from the Yucatan have been found in New Mexico because of these trade networks.
And so basically what would happen is that these people up in the north, who are sometimes called the Chichimeca, which is basically the Nahuatl term for barbarians, they would hear that there's trouble going on down in the Mexico Valley, and they were more nomadic in general, and so they would come down and try to get some tribute, maybe some spoils, and sometimes they would also settle down. And so the Nahua people started to move down into the Valley of Mexico around the year 500, and they became the dominant language group in that area from around 1100. As for the Aztecs themselves, they first come into the historical record as the Mexica around the year 1248, when they settled on the shore of Lake Texcoco. And basically, these were the new guys in the neighborhood. So they were very scrappy. They were sort of not very wealthy. And so they got pushed around a lot by these neighboring, more established states, which were also Nahua speaking. And around the year 1299, they received permission from the leader of Colua to settle in empty land around the city of Colhuacan to become his vassals. But they ran afoul of him sometime around the year 1323 when they asked for his daughter. And this guy presumed that he would be marrying like the leader of the Mexica. But this is an infamous story. And so basically, like, this wedding ceremony is going on. You have all these festivities. People are dancing. And suddenly a priest appears wearing a flayed skin. And as he takes a closer look, he realizes that this priest is wearing the skin of his daughter. And naturally, this did not breed many good intentions. So the Mexica had to pack up and move again. And they did this. And so they moved over to the site of what became Tenochtitlan, which at that point was sort of an island in the middle of this lake that hadn't been settled because it was generally understood to be rather poor land. But they set up their chiampas, which is sort of like sort of these floating patches of land, kind of the equivalent of Venice. And they came to the site because the leader of the Mexica had a dream that he was to go to a place where he would see an eagle sitting on a cactus and eating a snake, which is a symbol that appears on the current Mexican flag. And so they established themselves in Tenochtitlan, and they proved themselves to be very capable and negotiators and very crafty. And over the course of the century, they became sort of the big dog of this area.
Right, yeah. And I think what all this goes to show is that there were these incredibly rich and often very volatile relations between the many different societies of Mesoamerica at this time, which, as we're about to find out, this animosity was immediately, possibly even accidentally, exploited by the Spanish newcomers.
And essential to their success.
Totally essential. I know that Russian Sam, you were saying, I believe, that less than 10% of the soldiers participating in the siege of Tenochtitlan would have been Spaniards.
Oh, yeah. The overwhelming majority of them would have been indigenous warriors from peoples like the Tlaxcalteca and the Totonacs. And so basically, I think that it might be helpful to frame this rather than purely a Spanish conquest of the Americas as a larger regional war that the Spanish sort of walked into at a very opportune moment and managed to exploit in a way that benefited them.
And fundamentally changed the region, obviously.
So we were wondering, Paula, what do you think about, very big question here, very broadly speaking, in the TV show Hernán, how well do you think they depicted the way that the Spanish walked into this ongoing conflict?
They fell into the same sort of myth that's been perpetuated by Spanish histories, which is that is that yes, Cortez was lucky. He found this translator to help him with his alliances, but that he was the prime mover. That like he was the one that would make these alliances, and he was the one that would strategize and figure out all what he needed to figure out in order to fulfill his goal. But the reality of it is that it was Tlaxcala that were the prime movers of the situation. When Cortez landed in the coast of Mexico, he first hooked up with the Totonacs, who had heard of his military battles with the Maya,
right?
And
which I guess that's I believe, is that the second issue of the third issue of your comic?
Third issue of the series I'm working on. So they had heard of these Maya being defeated, and they certainly didn't want to be defeated. So they decided to make peace with them. But that was putting them in a between a rock and a hard place, because now they were having to juggle this new group with the pre-existing Mexica. So they were kind of weighing it. And so they gave them the information about how Tlaxcala is the Aztecs' best enemies, and if you want to try and take on the Aztecs, you got to get the Tlaxcala on board with this. So Cortez goes to Tlaxcala, but Tlaxcala isn't having any of it. These guys, who are these guys? And it might be a trick. And so they fought for weeks, and they almost destroyed them. And right before the Spanish were about to be wiped out completely, the prince of Tlaxcala said, it was the king, said, we should make these people essentially our special ops, our special forces. And so the prince of Tlaxcala, he wasn't a fan of that, but he said, there might be something to this. Let's see, maybe we can get these guys to help us take over Mexica, and then we can deal with them. And then maybe we can, come out on top of all of this. So to me, Cortez was almost like a pawn in the whole situation. But that's not how most history books record it. Most history books have him as the main guy, and everything's centered around him, and he's the one that made all these decisions. Whereas he just saw opportunities and says, yeah, I like that plan. Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. And I found the way that this series, the show, did depict indigenous influence over Hernan's decision-making pretty offensive, because if Russian Sam, tell me if I'm getting this right, but in the series, what's the name of this prince of the Totonacs?
Xicotencatl.
Thank you. Yeah, how he has this vendetta against the Mexica, and he also happens to be in an incestuous relationship with his sister, who is christened Maria Luisa, which I assume is right, Paul, totally fictitious, completely made up. Yeah, I know. I have to wonder if maybe they just they were looking at Game of Thrones and they saw what worked, and they just drew from here and there. And what I found really just a pretty distasteful is that her character, Maria Luisa, we can get into this. We'll get into this event in a minute, but she essentially is a driving force behind the massacre of Cholula, as the show depicts it, where this indigenous woman convinces the Spaniards to commit an act of genocide in this one Mexica town.
Well, it's not really Doña Luisa in the series per se, but yeah, generally that's the drift of the series, that the only reason that the Spanish went to Cholula in the first place is because, these wily Tlaxcaltecas with their own personal interests just decided that they want to massacre the city in revenge for something that they had done to them at some point. Yeah, it's just incredibly distasteful.
It's basically just depicting them as like a primitive people who are just have these ancient hatreds and grudges, and what could the Spaniards do?
Well, I mean, there is some truth to the fact that that Tlaxcala did get Cortez and his men to massacre the Cholulans, but it was not just because they're savage people. It was a culmination of a long time civil war in which Cholula would sort of go back and forth between the Mexica and the Tlaxcala in terms of political control. And just the year before Cortez showed up, Cholula fell back into Mexica control, and Tlaxcala was really upset about that. So in my story, and this is my take on this, so, and I hope it's an informed one, is that when Tlaxcala decides to ally with Cortez and his men, they make this bargain. They say, okay, here is the situation. You do this thing for us, and we'll do this thing for you. So what the Tlaxcala wanted was Cholula back in their hands. So and what Cortez wanted was to defeat the Mexica. So this worked for everybody's purposes. So Cortez, if he didn't have to go to Cholula, in fact, that's out of their way. If you look at a map, that's not from Tlaxcala to Tenochtitlan is a pretty straight line, and Cholula's way down over here. So it wasn't about convenience. It wasn't even about keeping a supply line open to the coast. It was this Faustian bargain. And so and this is a take that's in one of the more important indigenous accounts, the Florentine Codex.
Right. Yeah.
But, the Florentine Codex has its own issues because it was written after the fall of Tenochtitlan. It was written by Mexica rivals under Spanish friar supervision. So it has issues. But even that says that the Cholula massacre, that there was no plot to kill the Spaniards, that that this was undertaken by either the Tlaxcala or Cortez. They're not specific in the Florentine Codex. They just say that Cholula did not provoke anything.
And just to take a very quick step back here, the Cholula massacre, which was an act of genocide in the city of Cholula, the traditional justification is that supposedly the lords of this city were planning on massacring all the Spaniards there. Supposedly the Spanish insisted that it was a preemptive strike.
Yes, and there's a lot of problems with that because some of the things that Diaz describes as like signs were European style tactics that were not used by Mesoamericans.
It's just not true.
Yeah.
It's just a lie.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is that if that's the case, where was the Aztec army? There was supposed to be an Aztec army parked, outside the city, ready to go in and kill everybody. But apparently after the Cholula massacre, that Aztec army vanished.
Oh man!
So it's
And that kind of thing is all too poignant today. Do we believe Cholula has weapons of mass destruction?
Yeah, and Cholula would actually be a very controversial point even among the Spaniards themselves. In fact, Cortez himself would be brought on trial to answer for his conduct in Cholula. And during the trial itself, this is interesting. I dug this up. On the stand, Cortez himself said that he was getting ready to enter quote-unquote rougher country, and he thought it would be expedient to execute some Indians so that it would be known how he punished treachery so that he should be feared, and also for the purposes of giving law. So essentially this was a very common tactic used by the Spaniards, shock and awe. Like basically they were trying to show that resistance is futile, and if you show the slightest hint of being against the Spaniards, you will be utterly annihilated.
You stand no chance. We are superior in every way.
Yeah. Well, hey, let's actually. This is a great chance to talk more about the character of Hernán specifically. In your comic, Paul, I found interesting. You really seem to depict him as basically a grifter, somebody who is well versed in law and is able essentially to bend the Spanish law to suit his own financial interests.
Yes, absolutely was. He really was. He was. Before he became famous for this Mexican adventure, he was known as a gambler and a womanizer, a guy with a silver tongue who could talk anybody into anything. Essentially, kind of, like you were saying, a grifter.
Kind of a con artist almost.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you would,
and he kept up the womanizing for sure.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, those, you would need the silver tongue skills if you're going to try and, get this group of Spaniards to follow you into this unknown world, fully realizing that they could be killed at any minute. He would just actually, it's funny you say that because Cortez is like the characters in The Producers, where he would promise everybody all this stuff. You're going to get 10%, you're going to get 20%, you're going to get, and then all of a sudden he's like 700% of his enterprise is being promised away. And as a result, there was lawsuits, not just things like Cholula, but there was just lawsuits about how I didn't get my money that you promised.
Well, I know, Russian Sam, you made the really good comparison that in a way, colonialism was like the first venture capitalism.
Oh yeah, for sure. Especially these expeditions. Just to go back to what Paul said when he described the Spaniards as a group of people. It should be noted, this was not an army by any stretch of the imagination. Most of these people had absolutely no military experience, no training. Essentially, what would happen is that they would make a certain contribution to buy the weapons, horses, armaments, provisions for the expedition itself, and And then should the expedition be successful, they were entitled to a share of the spoils or the...
They were investors.
Yeah, no, before Silicon Valley, it was the Valley of Mexico.
One of my favorite members of the Spanish expedition was this guy who was a musician, and that was his thing. He was like, he was a walking iTunes, and he according to Diaz, he had the best horse of all, even the captains who are fully experienced in combat and stuff like that. But so I like to joke about how that proves that pop musicians will always have the sweetest rides in any point in history.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I thought it was a cute touch that you mentioned the names of the horses in the comic.
Because I have the information. Any piece of information, no matter how small, I will try and work it into the comic in some way. That kind of thing really gives verisimilitude to everything.
Yeah.
When you can have those kinds of details. And for instance, one of the things I'm doing here, which I'm having to structure myself, I'm having to work out for myself, is the dates. Because Diaz gives a few dates, and there's some dates from the Florentine Codex. So, certain things. So I have some good basic dates to work off of.
Yeah.
And then what I do is I rely on descriptions, usually by Diaz, saying a week later or 3 days later or stuff like that. And then I do my math. And then, and then some of the dates, I'll just are conjecture, but what they're trying to do is just drive home for the reader, of that this is a real thing, real events happening, and over this time period. Yeah. And it's remarkable that the entire story just takes place within 3 years. I mean, all of this stuff goes down and just
unbelievable. No, yeah. If we could go back to the character of Cortez for a minute, the main conquistador in question. I know that so both Rush and Sam, you and Paul are more familiar with the personality of Cortez, the real person, than I am. How exactly would you say this TV show depicted the protagonist, and how do you feel about that?
Actually, I think they got it pretty close. They're obviously emphasizing the heroic aspect. They're not showing as much of his Weasley side. But I thought that I'm a big fan of Oscar Janeda. I'm a big fan of his. I've seen a bunch of his pictures. I would highly recommend his biopic of Cantinflas. He just nails Cantinflas. It's fantastic. So I was happy with his performance and the general interpretation of Cortez, as being having this very focused goal. I wish we could have seen a little bit more of his kind of smiley, whimsical, kind of like cajoling, kind of the way that he would sell his goals to his men.
We get a tiny bit of that, but not as much as we should.
Yeah. We mostly get him, being, like dressing down people, why did you do this? Why did you do that? But yeah, I mean, again, the issue really is he has more agency than I think he did, but their take on him is not far off. I mean, the look of it, like his armor has all his filigree, which it wouldn't have had. His hair is all stringy and long to his shoulders, which is not the case. I mean, people forget that people would keep their hair short or at least above their necks, because they wouldn't bathe all the time. They wouldn't be bathing every single day, and they're in the tropics, and it's hot, and there's all these mosquitoes and bugs. And whatever, and shit gets in your hair. And so having long, stringy hair is not.
Well, I know the lack of bathing is definitely something that in your work, the indigenous characters are very quick to notice among the Spanish.
I got a lot of grief about that from Spanish nationalists on Twitter.
Oh, that's so perfect.
Oh, that's hilarious.
They love pointing out that, wait, we had soap. And yes, you had soap. Absolutely. I'm not saying that you didn't have soap.
These guys didn't
have hygiene or whatever. Yeah. Sure, you brush your teeth with, I get that. But every single day, because if you miss a couple days, I know if I miss a couple days, So
this is something that people in all over the world have noted about colonizing forces in those centuries.
Yeah.
I mean, even into the Napoleonic era, the Egyptians were talking about how the French soldiers smelled like shit.
And I make sure actually, interestingly enough, my series has probably the cleanest looking conquistadors, because even in Hernán, everybody is muddy and filthy and stuff like that. And people, at least, even if they didn't bathe every day, they wash their face. They cleaned up. So the idea of like people in that TV show with like dirt smudges and stuff, it's like, just no, they had cloths. They had wipe your face. That was a thing. It did exist. So and again the Spanish costumes, if you look at the from that era, the medieval Spanish outfits, they were also brightly primary colored. I mean, you look at like some of these Renaissance fair reenactors, from around that time, bright red, bright yellow, bright blue. So so even though Hernán was making out the Spanish to be the good guys in the story, they looked like bums.
Yeah.
No, they look like they just crawled out of a swamp.
Right. Yeah. And I know that Russian Sam, what you took most issue with his depiction, which I was wondering if you guys could talk about, was not so much the visual side, but how they really make Cortez almost seem reluctant at times. I think I know that Russian Sam, you've described him as sad boy Cortez.
The way that the show depicts him is that he's very set on his goals and he's not afraid to pursue them. But at the same time, he's constantly agonizing about how, oh, I'm so sad. I'm going to go to hell because I massacred these Cholulans. I'm going to go to hell because I left Alvarado in charge of Tenochtitlan while I had to leave the city and he massacred all these people. Their blood is on my hands. Oh, woe is me.
Yeah, like when Malintzin asks to hand him over, he gets these like puppy dog eyes and it's just ridiculous. Like he's actually considering it. Like, no.
I got the impression that this was very much sort of a shooting and crying type of thing where it's like, yeah, he's not perfect, but at the same time, he feels bad about what he does. So can you really be all that bad?
Right, exactly. He had to do it. He was forced into it. It's everybody's heard of the reluctant hero, which is a trope that's done too often.
Yes.
But here we have the reluctant villain. Oh, I gotta kill people.
There was, of course, Bartolome de las Casas a few decades later. But do you think there's much reason to believe that these individual conquistadors would have been remorseful to any extent? Do we know how they might have felt about it? I know that back in Spain there was some outcry about these abuses, as we've talked about. But what about among the men themselves?
I can't imagine too much remorse. You have to remember, and not just these Spaniards, but pretty much all humans at this time, we didn't have psychology, child rearing, books. We like the way that people behave towards each other, from our perspective, is a bit sociopathic. And you can't blame them. I mean, it was a pretty rough life. So it's you can never really get into somebody's head from 500 years ago.
Right. Yeah. And we shouldn't whitewash the Mexica here either, because they certainly had a very different calculation of the value of human life than we do in the U.S. today.
Yeah, but the thing is that it's hard for us to get our head around this. But like things like the skull rack was a celebration of life, not a celebration of death. But their relationship with death, it reminds me of, like, for instance, when you go to a funeral in New Orleans, and people are doing, this bright, colorful music and celebration of this person's passing. It's just a different attitude that's difficult for modern Western thought to get their head around.
Could you maybe talk a little bit about the underpinnings of this theology? Why did the Aztecs feel that they had to sacrifice people?
Well, there was the thing about fueling the gods, because the gods were in a continuous cycle of struggle. And then there was most of the sacrifices were essentially prisoners of war. So they would fight in these things called flower wars, and they would fight to capture.
Yeah.
And this arrangement would give everybody on both sides both practice in combat and some people to take up the altar. Now, there's an interesting discussion about the morality of, if you're in war, the morality of killing a soldier on the battlefield or taking him and killing him later in a temple thing. And for this culture, that was the height of honor as a warrior, is to die in combat or die on the altar, because then you're going to the number one spot in the afterworld. You're going to the highest level.
Well, the show kind of gets into that with the death of Moctezuma. Was that historical at all? The fact that he was killed at Cortez's hand for his own spiritual well-being, or is that completely fictitious?
No, that's a complete fiction. The general assumption on the Spanish side is that they made up this story about how he was on a rooftop trying to calm his people down, and somebody threw a stone and it hit him on the head. And I've seen reenactments where he falls from that and falls to the ground, which of course is total nonsense. And I find that there are things in my story which have the myth around it is so built in that I want to address it, not just in the endnotes, but I want to kind of see if I can't incorporate it into the main body of the story. Yeah, so, for instance, that scene, I probably will. I mean, it's a ways off. I haven't solidified it yet, but I probably will depict Montezuma on the rooftop being forced by the Spaniards to try and see if they can't calm down these people. And why not? Why not have a scene where a couple people throw some stones? By this time, they were pissed off at Montezuma. So, but that doesn't kill him. He according to Diaz, Diaz's version is that he's so distraught and he goes into such a depressive funk that he refuses to eat or sleep or whatever. He doesn't, and then he just dies from wasting away. Unfortunately, Diaz wasn't paying attention to the fact that they split town like just the day or so after that rooftop speech. So there's no way that he would have been able to. He didn't have enough time to waste away. Yeah. And once the Spaniards realized that Montezuma was useless, they killed him. They killed him and several of his top leaders that were. Like for instance, the leader of Texcoco had been captured, and so some of the Montezuma and his main group were all killed. Or the Spaniards left town.
And just to take a step back here, this was at a very kind of chaotic period when Montezuma was a captive of the Spaniard, while the remnants of the Triple Alliance were actively at war with the Spanish contingent.
Yeah, at this point, what happens is Cortez had arrived in the city, and there was a split faction of Montezuma's inner circle. One recognizing these people as marauders and let's just kill them as soon as we can. The other side saying, no, these people are ambassadors from a distant land, and so we have to go through these protocols. We have to give them gifts. We have to do this, and actually, Restall in one of his recent books, when Montezuma met Cortez, suggested a very interesting motive thing, which I'm totally going to use in this series, which is Montezuma. He's the ruler of the known world. I mean, the hubris of this guy. I mean, he knew, he was. I mean, he doesn't get any. He's practically a god. Yeah. So,
as you say, like to the north is impenetrable desert, and to the south is impenetrable jungle.
So he's got everything under his skin. With a few exceptions. Okay, some of the Maya and Tlaxcala aren't, but you know what? He's got this whole empire, and so he was also super into collecting. I mean, super into it. So he would have an entire building in the sacred precinct that was devoted to foreign objects, like almost a little reliquary, where he'd have all these cool objects from around the empire. And then he had this massive zoo that not only included all kinds of different animals and birds and whatever, fish, but also he had an entire complex in his building in this complex devoted to unusual humans. So people with pituitary things who were kind of giantism or hunchbacks, or just deformities of whatever. Yeah. And so when he heard about these new group of people, and through circumstance they wind up at his front door, he put them in a palace that was right next to his zoo of unusual humans. So for me, this tips off like what he was thinking about. He's dangerous, super dangerous new addition to his collection.
That's hilarious.
And that he believed that maybe he could control them in some way. And of course, that didn't happen.
Yeah. And then there's so many cases in history of mercenaries becoming conquerors. The Mamluks in Egypt. It happens again and again. Yeah. And so actually to touch on something we were talking about a little bit earlier, the idea of honor in this society was the ultimate. In fact, just protocols when you talk to each other, like you would have to do all these linguistic hoop jumpings before you even get to your point. And so the
whole Lord, my great Lord thing.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, but even more elaborate.
So the idea that that everybody need to be, that it's sort of like, I don't know. It's sometimes I think of it as like Klingons or samurai. Where you sort of have to. So your social protocols sort of demand interacting with the other in a way that may be against your own instincts. It's like, I don't know if I should be dealing with this guy, but but everything in my society, the way that I'm supposed to deal with this people. So there was these things with between having to honor stuff. Like, for instance, going back to the warriors. Like, if you would be captured and you take it was an honor. This was an honor for them,
right?
Or so there was a lot of the thinking about how to deal with your enemy came from this maybe misplaced sense of honor and protocols.
Right.
Also, this linguistic stuff would actually be very central to the conquest story.
Oh, absolutely.
Basically, as the accounts, both Bernal Diaz and the other Spaniards, as well as some of the Nahua sources that we have, talk about how, because of these politeness protocols, Moctezuma basically was telling Cortés that, like, oh, of course, I recognize Carlos V as a great leader, and I would be honored to be his vassal. And of course, we will form a great alliance together. And in fact, you can have my palace. I was actually just keeping the seat warm for you. Like, essentially, it was the opposite of what was explicitly said, with the impression that essentially that they're pledging fealty to the Spaniards.
Right. I don't think that they realized that was the case at all. It was a misinterpretation on the Spanish side about polite phrasing. Like, for instance, if I were to say, if you were to come over to my place and I would say, my place is yours, my house is, mi casa, su casa. Well, I don't literally mean that it is now your house. It's a figure of speech. And so they were taking these things, like, for instance, there was, this is after the conquest, when people are writing stuff down in the colonial texts. The idea that the Spaniards were thought of as gods is total nonsense, and it's based off of a misunderstanding of this word Tule, which can mean God, but really what it means is someone above me, a lord. So when they would say these, they weren't saying these Spaniards were gods. They were saying these Spaniards were lords. They were people of some kind of important status.
That myth is so common. I'm growing up in the U.S. Like, you don't really learn too much about the specifics of the Mexican conquest, but you always are taught that the Aztecs believed Cortés was a god.
Right.
And of course, you see that bleed into the show very extensively, even though at a certain point, Moctezuma realizes that, like, these people aren't gods, but nevertheless, this is the impression that one is left with, that initially they may have thought this, even if they later changed their mind.
It's just not true.
No. The Aztecs did not believe they were gods.
No, even in Diaz's own memoirs, he has a scene where Cortés and Montezuma are talking, and both of them are going, "See, we're just regular people. We're not, you're not a god, I'm not a god. We're just,
That's really interesting.
The other giant myth outside of Cortés being prophesized as a returning Quetzalcoatl, which was a post-fall colonial myth. The other thing that's really unfortunate and shows up in Hernán, and it really disturbs me, is the idea that this 16-year-old sex slave would somehow fall in love with Cortés and they would have a romance. And they would sneak around. They would sneak around the palace. They go around the corner here and kiss and make out. It's like, are you kidding me?
It's absurd and
absolutely no. And this is of course the character of Malinche or Malitzin.
Yeah, we don't really. History does not give us her original name. People have speculated based on Malintzin that it may have come from the word for the day of grass, a grass day.
Right.
That was a naming convention. People did name people after these calendar days, but that's a total guess. So as a result, I've had to just kind of refer to her with her colonial name, Marina.
And she's somebody of whom we know quite little, right? Especially her motivations.
Right. Diaz writes, I think, 2 paragraphs on her, and every bit of information about her comes from these 2 paragraphs in Diaz's memoir. So it's up to like really smart anthropologists, like Camilla Townsend, to try and break it down and try and figure out. Give her some kind of dimension, give her some kind of personality, give her some kind of motivation for what she did. Because a lot of people go on about how she's the great betrayer of her country.
The only time she has an agency is, as this traitor. I know that in Mexico today, the word malinchismo means essentially might as well mean treachery.
Right. It's somebody who prefers stuff outside of their own culture.
Right. Yeah.
And I mean, she in this one codex, the Tlaxcala Codex, it shows her directing military operations. It shows, a little drawing of her doing, pointing, and in one she has a sword and stuff like that.
Right.
And that was done, that Tlaxcala Codex was done as a political thing to try and tell the king and everybody that, no, we are kind of responsible for Cortez's success, and look at all the stuff that we did. And they thought that by giving her a more important role, that would sort of connect the two worlds, that she was like a linchpin between, as an indigenous person, but serving with the Spaniards. And so this is like the bridge between the two worlds.
And of course, because she was the mother of one of Cortez's children.
Yes, right. Well, she technically like when also people give her the role of being the mother of Mexico in terms of like her children being the first mestizos.
Which is very it's a weird nationalist kind of thing. It's
right. But technically there was other people there was other indigenous women that bore Spanish children before she did.
Oh sure, yeah. Oh yeah. Like you suggest in your comic that there was an earlier man in Maya territory who essentially went native, who decided to stay living with the Maya rather than join the Spanish conquest.
Right. He's the first historically recorded intermarriage and mestizo child that we know.
Right.
Yeah, and this guy was kind of a big deal. Like, he became a chieftain in his own right.
And what's this guy's name? If you could...
Gonzalo Guerrero.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so when the Spanish showed up and they said, "Oh, we're finally here to rescue you," you depict this very well in your comic. He was basically saying, "Oh, what are you talking about? I have a family now. I'm now one of the Maya. Get away from here." And I believe he would later die fighting against the Spanish.
Now, I think it's crazy. That's an amazing story. That's such a great narrative. But instead, the show gives us Sad Boy Cortez.
In one of the episodes, we get a Sad Boy Cortez origin story, which is totally fictitious.
Oh, God. Yeah. Oh, God. Yeah. So, yes, those who haven't seen it, the TV show suggests essentially that the teenage Cortez had a crush on a Muslim girl who was killed in the Inquisition.
Yeah, so essentially what happens is, he's a child, and he's constantly sneaking off to see this girl named Aisha, and his parents don't like that, so they send him away to Salamanca to study law, so he's not around this Moorish girl, and then he comes back. She's an adult now, she's beautiful. Cortez really wants to marry her, but then lo and behold, she's caught by the Inquisition as being crypto-Muslim. Her family had converted to Christianity because at that point it became very dangerous for non-Christians within the Spanish Peninsula to continue to practice their faith. And so she's found out, and the Inquisition tortures her to death. And we have this great scene where Cortez is outside of the prison and listening to her screams, and he's just crying about how heathens should be converted, they shouldn't be killed.
It's great, and it sets him up. The point of that scene is it's to humanize him in a way that sets him up as this reluctant genocide heir, as somebody who was doing this essentially a righteous conquest, as the show puts it, a justified conquest, but he was always the one trying to keep it moderate. It was the people around him, like Alvarado, like the character Maria Luisa, the converted Totonac woman, who were really the ones, pushing for the excesses of violence. And as far as I can tell, that is totally fictitious. They're trying to... They want the protagonist to be a more conflicted character to tell a better story, but it seems like in the process, they're really just whitewashing one of history's biggest bastards.
It is... I do believe it is true that Cortez wanted to keep Tenochtitlan intact, that he regretted razing it to the ground, because it would have been a great, feather in his cap. It would have been this crown jewel. And so I do believe that he was not saddened by it. He was disappointed. He's like, oh man, I wanted to show this off to the Spaniards are going to be showing up. And the reluctant villain thing, and the whole thing about Cortez having romantic relationships. I mean, he had multiple girlfriends. A couple of them came on this expedition. I just found that out just recently because there's this book written by Hugh Thomas called Conquest, and it's the most detailed history that we have to date. And he wrote a supplemental piece called "Who's Who of the Conquistadors," in which he went to Spanish records and found everybody who participated in it through logs or diaries or court proceedings. And he broke it all down in a very accessible book that allows you to just look up people really quickly. And there's a section about the women of the expedition. And there was a dozen women that came with Cortez, which is not in the TV show at all.
No, yeah.
And then another couple
Although we do get Juana.
Well, but they're depicted. She's depicted as coming with the Navarez expedition, which was
right.
So then a year later, all these women show up, and in fact, there was a dozen already there at the time, and two of them, Cortez was sleeping with, and this is why he was able to give away all the indigenous. That's why he didn't keep any indigenous women for himself. Because he was set up, and besides, I can only imagine what some of these Spanish women might have said about that. Say, hey, wait a minute, I'm right here. What are you doing? Yeah. And so as a result, he could just give away all the indigenous women. And in fact, I even have in my story coming up in the next episode, I have once he figures out how important Marina is for his goals.
And Marina is the Catholic name of Malitzin.
Right, Malitzin. Well, yeah, she was called Malitzin by that. Right. So once he figures out her importance, in my story, and this is based on a suggestion from Camilla Townsend, I have her being sequestered. So she's taken away from the guy he gave her to. He gave her to this guy named Puerto Carrero. Yeah. In the Hernán show, Puerto Carrero doesn't exist. It because there's so many characters, they just dropped him, and they have I believe it's Sandoval who's given this girl, and just to keep the characters from getting out of control. And then Cortez takes her back, but in my story, he needs her to learn Spanish. Mm-hmm. So and Aguilar, the Maya translator who's with them, needs to learn Nahuatl. So in my story, the logical thing is that they're put together in their own hut, tent, whatever lodgings. He was celibate. He was studying to be a priest, so he's not going to be sleeping with anybody. So Cortez can trust him, and then he gives him. He basically makes him the chaperone. He says and make sure that she's not molested by anybody, because she's so crucial that the idea of her becoming pregnant, being sidelined for, because they don't know what the timetable is. They don't know how long they're going to be doing this. They don't know what's coming next. And she needs to be able to, for instance, run if it gets in trouble.
Yeah. No,
or there's just so many reasons for her not to get pregnant. So that also is another nail in the coffin about this myth about Cortez and Malitzin having some kind of great romance. I mean, 2 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, through circumstances, she winds up living at Cortez's hacienda for a little while. Mm-hmm. And during that time, he essentially rapes her, and she has a kid, Martin. Mm-hmm. But then that's it. And then as soon as she gets pregnant, he marries her off to a conquistador so that he doesn't have to take responsibility for that. Later, he will acknowledge that it is his kid. But so that behavior just, again, reinforces the fact that this romance thing is total BS.
Yeah, maybe we should get a little further into the character of Malitzin as we know her in the historical sources. So can you give a quick summary of who she was and how she ended up with the Spanish?
Sure. So she was a Nahua, not a Mayan, and she was just grew up in this small town. She was she knew how to speak High Nahuatl as opposed to the regular version, the plebeian version. So so that indicates that she was part of a family that was either connected to or part of the royalty of that city-state that she grew up in. And Diaz suggests that when her mom remarried, she was sold off so that there wouldn't be any issues about succession. But she wouldn't have been able to succeed anyway. She was a girl, so that explanation is nonsense. So there is no real understanding about how she wound up being a slave. But when she was sold, she traveled enough with whoever her owners were to the point to where she got to Tabasco and was in the service of the Tabscoob, King Tabscoob.
Yeah, great name.
And there are some accounts that maybe she was part of his little entourage of mistresses.
Yeah.
But the thing is that you don't give up a slave to your enemies who is valuable or who does good work for you. So the idea that I had was that if she was sort of high ranking, not necessarily nobility, but high ranking, she would have had a little bit of an attitude of some kind. Mm-hmm. She would have been resentful of the fact that she grew up in decent situation and now found herself a sex slave of the Maya. So my guess in the comic is that she's too haughty for her employers, even though she's beautiful. So she's like, oh, this is a problematic slave. Let's put her in with this batch with these other slaves that are being given as part of this tribute. So that's how she winds up with the Spaniards. And then people discover that she can speak Nahuatl when they first arrive at the coast. They had been dealing with Maya, and so there was no problem in having their Spanish Aguilar castaway translate that. But once they get to the coast and they first start dealing with the Aztecs on the coast, then Aguilar can't translate anymore. And this becomes apparent from the first time that Aztec emissaries, they actually row out in a canoe and get on board this ship.
Yeah.
And they start talking to them, and nobody can understand them. And Malintzin, who is Puerto Caro's girlfriend here, or she's whatever, sex toy. I don't know how to describe it. It's intense. Mm-hmm. Anyway, she is on deck with Puerto Carrero and chimes in. She actually says, and she's this is the person. and then all of a sudden everybody goes, what? You can speak this language? And then Cortez immediately goes into his silver tongue promise thing. Promise her I will give her all kinds of gold and I'll make her a free woman. And I'll do this and that if she translates for us. And so that's how she winds up being the translator.
So in the show, aside from the romance, quote unquote, between Hernán and Malintzin, we also see Malintzin being depicted as a political operator in her own right. In a number of moments, Cortez says one thing, and she'll subtly twist the meaning of what he said so that it's more palatable to the listener. And in another case, in the scene where where the Spaniards make their way into Totonac, they capture some members of this Aztec delegation. And the Totonacs, they had been reluctant to join the Spaniards because the Mexica are so powerful, we can't possibly take them on. So they captured these people, and they bring them into the palace of the Tlatoani, the king of that city. And they throw these people onto the floor, and Malintzin says, unprompted, all on her own, this is what my lord will do to the Mexica. Yeah, she's shown to be somebody who isn't necessarily a victim, but rather somebody who has agency, and I think I'm more sympathetic to that interpretation because essentially she had been deeply wronged in this world. She had been forced into slavery. She really had nothing to really look forward to in the world as things as they were. So naturally she felt that by hitching her wagon to the Spanish, she could secure a future for herself.
Yeah, absolutely. There's certain protocol behavior things that she might not have crossed. She might not have, like the kind of thing of don't speak until you're spoken to, those certain kinds of protocols that she might not have crossed, but she did, on a couple occasions, she did sort of provide her own commentary about it. Like, for instance, of the very famous moment where Cortez is going to arrest Montezuma, put him under house arrest, and he's not going to do it. Uh-huh. And it's according to Diaz, it's Malintzin who says, if you don't, it's going to be worse. You're probably going to be killed. You should just play along with these people. So yeah, those kinds of situations, she probably would have offered her interpretation to whatever indigenous group she was addressing. She probably would have added her own little commentary about, I've seen what these people can do. I've seen this and I've seen that. So you should, so trust me on this one. That kind of thing.
Yeah. And I feel like on the subject of depictions of female characters in the series, I feel like we do have to mention that there's only one significant Spanish woman character in the TV show Hernán, who, at the end of the second episode, gets her heart ripped out. And yeah, she's not this character Juana is not very well fleshed out at all, but something that you dug up, Russian Sam, that I thought was interesting and shocking and kind of speaks a lot about the perspective of this show are that actress's words on her character's death.
First, let me set the stage a little bit. So, Juana in the show, she's the lover wife, it's not exactly clear, of a guy named Cristobal de Olid, who was a member of Cortez's expedition. And so she traveled with Panfilo de Narvaez to be reunited with Olid at some point. And essentially what happens is they're finally reunited, but then Olid has to go out of the city to find a way to get out, because this was after Alvarado had massacred the Mexica in their central square during a festival. And so they are ambushed, and several of them are killed, but Juana herself is captured and taken to the pyramid and sacrificed. And well, first of all, while there was a woman named Juana who was a semi-active participant, she was a doctor, according to Bernal Diaz, and he heaps high praise upon her. But that doesn't actually happen to her. The historical Juana survives until 1528, I believe.
Well, so this character, though, she really the only purpose she serves in the series really is to be killed, and specifically to illustrate what the show depicts as the savagery of the Aztecs.
Yeah, of course, because for maximum savage Indian context, make sure that they kill a white woman.
Yeah, definitely a very, very unfortunate history there with that specific depiction. And that's what, anyways, Russian Sam, I was wondering if you could basically summarize what you found about that actress describing that and how it was, let's just say, not the best read of Aztec-Spanish relations.
So she's giving an interview about the show, and she says, "In my opinion, as viewed in the first 3 episodes, it hits me that they have integrated this subframe into real history, as if there should be a need to have another interesting woman apart from Malinche, the indigenous interpreter and lover of Cortez. If Juana was not there, I do not understand what it would look like. We'll see her fight like men or be adjusted half naked at the top of the pyramid by the Mexica. For the rest, I am very interested in the history of the conquest of Mexico, which is always so controversial. The series tries to make the viewer understand that the indigenous people were savages, but that they had their own habits that needed to be accepted, and that the Spaniards had to deal with extreme conditions to survive. So before fear, the only answer was defense. Hernán Cortés was ambitious. He was not only there to inspect the ground, but to conquer, something that at first had nothing to do with his mission. So, yeah, she just straight up calls these people savages.
Yeah, and I guess and what that quote shows to me is that for at least some of the people involved in the production of this series, they had completely bought into the traditional Spanish nationalist myths of the conquest. And I find that distasteful and pretty disappointing.
To say the least, yeah.
Yeah, because this is such a high budget show, which is going to be viewed by so many people, I think they do have kind of a responsibility to depict history in a way that I would say necessarily challenges these nationalist myths by depicting the realities of the situation. And I think that clearly this show did not depict reality as well as it should have. And unfortunately, clearly some of the people involved in the production had no interest in challenging or subverting those myths at all.
Yeah, and it's a shame because it's right there in the history books. I mean, like you were talking about
Right.
the historical Juana, or
Yeah.
even some of the other women that were involved. Like there was this one woman, Maria Estrada, who came not as a cook or a nurse or as someone's girlfriend.
Yeah.
She came to fight. She was known as Tanza. Massacre because she was just a ferocious fighter, and
That's wild.
she fought on horseback. I mean, she was a badass conquistadora, and
Wow.
that was a missed opportunity. Could have checked.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and then of course, Juan Garrido was not really present in the series, the African conquistador.
Yeah, and then Xiconcadl's sister, the princess of Tlaxcala, she was instead of doing this ridiculous incest storyline with her brother, she could have been handled in a much more interesting way because I think she did have some influence with Alvarado in that massacre.
Yeah.
I'm not going to blame her, but she and her brother, I believe, spurred on Alvarado because he had been dressed down multiple times by Cortez at this point about overstepping. And he was so he was in a situation where it's like, I'm just going to sit in the palace and not, and just wait for him to get back. And then this festival, which went on for a few days, here's the thing. Alvarado could not have known this, but the festival participants were the top commanding generals of the Mexica army. This was a specific ceremony that involved their participation. So the Tlaxcala could have informed Alvarado and his men about that. It's like, if you want to chop the head off the Mexica military, here's the chance right now, right here and right now. Because they didn't bring their weapons. It wasn't about that. So they were unarmed. And it's sort of like, what if you had, the Joint Chiefs of Staff all show up to a party and you had some villain, wanting to take them out. It's like right there. Or like, like Inglourious Bastards, when all the Nazis.
Absolutely.
It's like, okay, here's our chance.
Yeah, the movie theater. Yeah, and I'm going to assume that the Aztecs didn't have a designated survivor in their constitution.
No. In fact, actually, one of the main characters, one of the main female characters I want to deal with is Montezuma's daughter.
Please tell us about her.
And she was married to this commanding general who was in line to be the next emperor.
And was this the daughter who Cortez also had a child with?
Yes, again, after the years
After all this,
Tenochtitlan fell.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what a guy. So the daughter was married to one of these commanding generals who was then killed during this massacre. And so she winds up getting married to, when Montezuma dies, she winds up marrying his successor, who only stays around for a month or so because smallpox by this time is coming into the city. And then she's married again to Cuauhtémoc, who was the great resistance leader, who was the last emperor of the Aztecs. And then after that, she's married to a couple of conquistadors after the fall of Tenochtitlan. She has the ultimate telenovela story. And so the fact that the show didn't even acknowledge her existence whatsoever was real surprising to me because they could have done a lot with that character.
Yeah.
Well, we do see a daughter of Moctezuma briefly. I'm not sure if this is the same one, but Cortez actually does marry her in the show.
Yeah, Montezuma had multiple daughters. The one I'm referring to, who shows up in even that Vivaldi opera I was mentioning earlier, she has always been depicted as a girl of about 11. But that's because of a transcription error in the 16th century. She was actually 17, 18 years old. So she was a full teenager.
Yeah, which is much more cinematic, I would say.
Yeah. So I've seen other versions of this story where Montezuma's daughter is this little 11-year-old girl. Yeah. And she's used as a political pawn because then she's married off to these successive emperors to legitimize their situation. Oh, see, this new emperor is married to the daughter of the old emperor.
Yeah. No. Actually, one thing that Russian Sam, I think it was you that we're talking about lately, how even if we go down to the other America for just a very quick little detour, in the early days of Argentina, there was even a plan to install a descendant of the Incas in the 19th century as a monarch of Argentina, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, it was called the Inca Plan. At that point, what was to become Argentina included the city of Cusco.
Included parts of Peru, yeah. So it makes, yeah. Well, on the subject of, what happened after the first stage of the conquest, Paul, we've kept you for an hour and a half now, and it's so nice of you again to lend your time. It's really been fun this evening.
Yes, thank you so much.
But what I was wondering is if we could end with sort of a where are they now kind of thing. Because I know that many of the characters involved in the TV show Hernán, and of course also your comic book, had very interesting second acts that weren't depicted in the show. I know that Russian Sam, you looked up a few of these, and I was wondering if we could just very briefly go into what happened to some of these people afterwards. Like, I think that the first one, for instance, I know that Olid, the conquistador, he had a very interesting life after the conquest.
Oh, yeah. And I'm a huge fan of Olid's story. So for context, we see in the show how Hernán Cortés declares his own governorship so that he would be away from the authority
of Cuba, to be clear. Cuba was the launching point for all this.
Yes, but what we don't know is that this was very common operating practice. Diego Velázquez himself became the governor of Cuba because he had set up his own colony of sorts and made himself governor by force. So yeah, then Cortés would carry on that tradition. And then after the destruction of Tenochtitlan and the conquest of many of the surrounding areas, Cortés sent Olid down to Guatemala to be the captain of an expedition to capture that part, only for, lo and behold, Olid to declare himself the governor. So at that point, Cortés is livid, even though he had done the exact same thing, and he gets Olid killed in 1524.
And what about Xicotencatl? I was wondering, are you going to get into his demise, Paul?
Yeah, that's a sad thing. He
this is the prince of the Totonacs,
right? The
Tlaxcalans.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So he never really wanted to hook up with these Spaniards, but he saw their usefulness in advancing their city-state, their republic. It was actually Tlaxcala was made up of a couple of like the Triple Alliance. They had their own little Triple Alliance. So I'm calling it the Tlaxcala Republic. There's different words you could probably use, but at a certain point in my comic, I want to be able to just have people reference it shorthand. So they talk about the Alliance and they talk about the Republic, and you know who you're referring to.
And was it a republic in a sense we recognize today?
It did have a kind of Senate, a kind of Congress, and so the decisions were taken collectively. And in fact, that caused some problems when they first started fighting with the Spaniards, because one of their factions didn't want to fight the Spaniards, another one did. And so they had to reconcile that. And I guess the king was the deal breaker. He was the one that finally said, okay, we're going to we're going to hook up with these guys and we're going to see if they can help us take the Mexica down a peg. Because even at this point, it wasn't even perceived that they could actually take over Tenochtitlan. It was more about getting sort of favored status, in this new political setup. I mean, nobody knew how it was all going to turn out. So this prince at a certain point realizes that this is during the siege of Tenochtitlan, and the prince realizes that the Spaniards are getting out of control, that they're now on autopilot, and that they don't need the Tlaxcala as much as they used to in terms of like political strategizing, that now it's just about, let's just siege this city. And we just need Tlaxcala and whoever else to provide manpower to just siege the city. So at this point, Xiconcatl, he starts to figure out, well, how can I, essentially like a coup, how can I regain control of the situation for the Tlaxcala? And he goes back to Tlaxcala to try and like organize a coup against the Spaniards, and he's discovered and caught and killed for it. And that's the one of the big blows to Tlaxcala having anything but a subservient role after everything goes down. Like at that point, everybody kind of realizes, oh, it looks like it's going to be these strangers who are going to be the top dogs, and the best that we can hope for is to be, the second toppest land. So
and did any of the this is a question for either you or for you, Paul, or Sam. Did any of the Mesoamerican nobility from Tlaxcala or anywhere, did they find themselves in an elevated position in the medium term?
They did.
More and more. Okay.
So for like at least a couple generations, they didn't have to pay taxes. They didn't have to do this, that, and the other. They were a favored. And then they wrote up this codex, which provides a lot of information.
Oh, that's it.
To show to the Spanish rulers that look at all the stuff that we did. We're your best pals. Treat us well. But eventually, over time, over generations, they were politically usurped, submerged,
culturally assimilated.
Yeah.
All right. So then next we have Bernal Diaz, who is the guy who wrote the true history of the Spanish conquest.
Is it fair to say, Paul, you think he's the primary source, at least for the series, for the TV show?
Yeah, absolutely he is. And in fact, he's the primary source for just about any telling of this story. With all of the problems, myths, errors, and stuff intact. It always winds up getting perpetuated, like telephone.
Yeah, so Bernal Diaz would end up living the longest out of any of these guys. He lived to almost 90, I believe. He had a very long and fruitful life. He got a governorship of Guatemala, and he only started to write his true history some 30 years after these events. And the reason why he was doing this is because he wanted to counter the histories as told by Hernán Cortés in his letters, and Gomara, who was sort of this guy who was hired by Cortés's family to paint him in as rosy a light as possible. And this is where I want to get back to the venture capitalist analogy. These guys were essentially writing quarterly reports back to Spain, back to the king, to talk about their accomplishments and all the great things that they themselves had done. And essentially this meant that, of course, the Cartas de Relaciones, the letters of Cortés that are often used as one of the primary sources, they are very much self-focused. Like Amalintzin only comes up twice, never by name, and everyone else is sort of a background character, whereas everything that has happened that's good, it's all Cortés is doing. Essentially, he was trying to show that he was worthy of all of these things. And after a while, it seemed that Bernal Diaz would be deprived of his estate because the Spanish were starting to pass these new laws, which would have stripped encomiendas from many of these families. So what Bernal Diaz was doing was essentially writing his own very long Carta de Relaciones.
To justify his land claim? Or
Yes, exactly.
Well, the best way to wrap this up, Paul, what happened to our good friend Hernán? What was Cortés's end after all this?
Well, for a little while there, he was on top of the thing, of everything. There was this famous story about, like, at the end of the siege, they had this giant banquet in the Zocalo, and he was on top. He was king, and his wife from Cuba came over to be with him. And by this time, though, he was like, he couldn't put up with her anymore. And he strangled her in a fit of rage one night. And he was put on trial for it. And he got off because his usual tactic of just bribing everybody. And the
boat that says so much about his character, the murder and the bribery.
Yes, and so, but then Spain started sending bureaucrats to Mexico, and and again, this is a testament to how he maybe is not as smart as history books tell us, because he was outmaneuvered by these Spanish bureaucrats, and then to the point to where he was, he didn't have the status that he used to, and he tried to go back to Spain and talk to the king himself. And that didn't really go very well. And so he started getting into debt. People started suing him because, all of his promises weren't coming. So it's just slow decline, to the point to where he comes back to Mexico and he's just living, in a decent place. And when he dies, he didn't really leave much. I think he was partly in debt. He had, what he left was some physical stuff, some sword collection. A few things like that. So he didn't. By the time he died, he was not necessarily totally broke, but he was out of favor, and he was, shadow of his former self. He'd spent years just trying to deal with these legal issues and these court political issues, and so to me, it also shows that Cortez, how he couldn't have possibly have been so clever, because if he was clever enough to take down an entire empire, how come he couldn't deal with a few Spanish bureaucrats? And then also the fact that he didn't have a remarkable life before he wound up in Mexico. I call it the Stan Lee effect. It turns out that Jack Kirby really created the Marvel Universe, and Stan Lee took a lot of credit for it. And Kirby died without writing an autobiography, and Stan Lee was able to go on for another decade or two, taking more and more credit about how he came up with all of it. Yeah. But if that's the case, how come his career before he met Jack Kirby and after he met Jack Kirby is nothing? There's no achievements. All the achievements that he has credit for happen to be involving this guy named Kirby. So little clues like that when you look at, and then this is something that Restall does when Cortez meets Montezuma. He points out that how come Cortez was only amazing for 2 or 3 years of his life? So there must be something else going on.
Yeah. So. First, let me just say again, thank you so much, Paul, for that. I just, while I was looking up the production of this show, I just found one anecdote that I thought was kind of revealing about the origin of this series and this production. So it was filmed both in Spain and in Mexico. They had a lot of scenes that were shot in Mexico City itself, the former location of Tenochtitlan, particularly in the canals, which they used to represent the real life canal system that existed in this Aztec capital. But while they were filming, this crew, which was both Spanish and Mexican, showed a complete disregard for the sanctity, or at least the kind of preservation of this very old canal system. And it led to just extensive pollution. So I think there's this really kind of interesting irony there, that in the process of creating this show about the destruction of Aztec society, they ended up themselves irreparably damaging one of the remaining legacies of that society, to the extent that the production was fined 74 million pesos because of the environmental and cultural damage they caused to those sites.
Yeah, it's Xochimilco. It's an area, the southern part of Mexico City. During the Aztec period, it was its own city-state, and it supplied Tenochtitlan with most of its produce. These gardens that they set up, and these days, it's been reduced to a very small. It's just a little small area of it left. Yeah, and within that small area, there's a pocket which is just tourism. It's those party boats that you've seen. Yeah, in fiction, and that's causing a real problem. But the rest of what remains is still a functioning farmland. I got the honor to go and visit this guy's farm, and so I saw these canals in their original state as they looked 500 years ago. It was a very moving experience for me, and yes, there's a section of it that was appropriated for the production, and they screwed it up. And get this, there was going to be another major production that was going to take advantage of the pre-existing setup there. They were going to do a thing with Javier Bardem as Cortez. Yeah. And Tena Huerta as Montezuma, who's just been cast as Namor in Black Panther 2. And just before they started shooting for a couple of weeks at that same location, and they were having the same issues. People were still complaining about it. and then COVID shut it all down.
Yeah,
they're not going to resurrect. They're not going to redo that production. So that was. I'm not sure it was for the best or not. I like to think it was not just for that location, so that they don't ruin it any more than they have. But also, like, did we need yet another slightly fancier, slightly better version of essentially Hernán? I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, especially because it's the same thing. It's that there are so many ways to tell this story, yet it really seems like every time you hear it told, it's the same way.
And I no longer. I mean, I understand that certain kinds of high budget things need to have what they call a four corner, like a four quadrant.
Oh, yeah. Four quadrant. Yeah.
Needs to appeal to everybody and all that. And so I get that. And some of these myths are kind of appealing. I can see as a writer, being suckered into like, oh, well, this is kind of cool, even though it's not exactly accurate.
Yeah. The Malinche romance is a natural, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. It is. I mean, like, it's very, very hard to try and do something else than that. But at this point, it doesn't have to be a $1 bazillion production. We have now digital technology in which you could do, shoot a lot of it with green screen set extensions. So the story is no longer. I don't think it should be intimidating people to try and do something that's a little less European, a little more indigenous, even if that means it's going to be more difficult to market or to make a profit from. I think the people should try and take a shot at doing a modest budget thing. And I don't care if I see the scenes. I don't care if it looks a little digitally or whatever. I don't care if it has, like a Sci-Fi Channel, Aztec Rex, bad CGI. I just want to see it done right, not necessarily all perfect.
All right. Well, that being said, thank you so much, Paul, first of all, for your work in helping to popularize this history, and second of all, for coming here to talk to us.
Yeah. And if anybody wants to see, I would say, a more accurate depiction of the Aztec conquest, you got to check out Aztec Empire.
It's still very early in the whole scheme of things. But the first collection, the first story that I want to put out into print, hopefully at the end of the year, where we get to the point to where the Totonac and the Castilians are allied, and now next is Tlaxcala. So the second volume will be.
That's great. Well, yeah, no, I can't wait.
So where can people find your work right now?
Go online, bigredhair.com. Apparently, because I'm the only person doing an Aztec Empire comic, you can literally just type into Google Aztec Empire comic, and you'll probably find my work.
All right. Well, we'll be sure to link it below. Again, we've said this a million times, but thank you so much for lending your time and your expertise, Paul. This has really been a fun one.
My pleasure. I enjoy it. Obviously, I'm committed to this project for years, so I'm happy to spend just a couple hours babbling about it. My pleasure.
Well, hey, we wish you the best of luck with the continuation of this project, and hopefully, maybe it will bring to light a more balanced perspective of these events. And here's hoping that maybe in the future there will be other filmed perspectives that are more nuanced than Hernán. And like you said, maybe they do take the risk to stray just a little bit from the European perspective.
Yeah. Well, they can certainly use my book as one-stop shopping for production design, script, everything.
Absolutely. Have a great night, Paul.
All right. Thank you so much.